My fiancée turned down a DNA test after texting with her ex. I don't need to prove anything. My family took her side, until the truth blew up everything. One text message shattered my entire world, and the silent, empty spaces above it spoke volumes. It meant everything I thought I knew about my family, about my future, was a lie. That night, the kitchen was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. The air felt heavy, even before I understood why, as my fiancé's phone buzzed on the counter. I'm Mark, 30 years old, working in HVAC. Up until that Tuesday night in March, I genuinely believed I had everything figured out. My fiancée, Sarah, and I had been together for 4.5 years. Our son, Leo, was 2.5, and we were set to get married that summer. Growing up, my own dad walked out when I was 6 to start another family across town. My mom, Diane, spent the next 2 decades reminding me and my younger brother, Kevin, that men couldn't be trusted. She became incredibly bitter, the kind of bitter where every mistake I made got compared to my father. Kevin got to coast, watching me held to this impossible standard. I swore I'd never be like my dad. I promised I'd never abandon my family, that I'd be the kind of man who stays, no matter what. I met Sarah at a coworker's barbecue 5 years ago. She was loud, funny, and we ended up in this ridiculous argument about burger joints that somehow led to us exchanging numbers. She was training to be a dental hygienist, seemed stable, serious about life. 9 months later, she moved into my place, a small house I'd bought just outside the city. Early on, we had the exes conversation. You know, the one where you set boundaries. She told me her last boyfriend, David, was toxic and jealous and she never wanted to talk about him again. I respected that. I even blocked my own ex when she texted me once, just to show Sarah I was serious about us. It became an unspoken rule between us, no contact with exes, ever. In early 2021, Sarah got pregnant. I proposed right away because I wanted to do things the right way. I wanted to give my kid the family I never had. Leo was born that September, and I was there for every single thing. The midnight diaper changes, the weekend jobs I picked up to cover extra bills, every tiny first that mattered. For me, being a dad wasn't just about Leo, it was about proving I could be different from the man who left me. That Tuesday started like any other. I came home from a job site, changed out of my work clothes, and started putting together dinner while Leo played with his blocks in the living room. Sarah went to take a shower and left her phone charging on the kitchen counter. Not unusual. Except this time, it lit up right as I walked past. I glanced at it without thinking, and that's when I saw the name David and the preview of his message. My stomach dropped before my brain even processed what I was reading. I picked up the phone, something I hadn't done once in 4.5 years, and opened the message thread. There was a photo of Leo from the zoo trip we'd taken over the weekend. Him, standing in front of the giraffe exhibit with this huge, happy smile. And underneath it, David had written, "He's got your eyes. Thanks for sharing these with me." The entire conversation history above that message was gone, completely wiped, like someone had carefully deleted every word they didn't want seen. It felt like holding a live wire, this tiny piece of evidence that someone had been looking into my life behind my back, that my fiancé had been sending pictures of our son to her ex and then covering her tracks. When Sarah came out of the bathroom, she was talking about something normal, asking if Leo had eaten. I just handed her the phone without saying a word. I watched her face change in real time, from relaxed to tense to defensive, in about 3 seconds flat. She tried to play it off at first, mumbled, "He's just an old friend. It's nothing serious." But I asked her why she'd delete the rest of the conversation if it was so innocent. She stumbled, said something about the app doing it automatically, which was obviously garbage. Then she flipped it on me, started accusing me of going through her phone and not trusting her, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I stood there listening to her scramble for explanations, and 3 things became crystal clear. She knew this looked bad, or she wouldn't have deleted everything. She knew I'd be upset, or she wouldn't have hidden it. And instead of apologizing, she was trying to make me feel guilty for catching her. That night, after she went to bed, I sat out in the garage, staring at my tools, and finally let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away since I saw that message: what if Leo isn't mine? It scared me more than anything else, more than the idea of her cheating, more than the lying. Because if he wasn't mine, then everything I'd built my life around for the past 2.5 years was a lie. I spent the next week living like a ghost in my own house. We only talked about logistics for Leo. At night, I'd pull up Google on my phone and search for at-home paternity tests, reading about accuracy rates and how the process worked. Finally, I sat her down and asked her point blank when exactly she and David had broken up. She stuck to the story she'd always told me 8 months before we met. I told her I wanted a paternity test, just to be sure, just to put this whole thing to rest. She exploded. She called it the worst insult I could ever give her, said I wasn't a real man if I could even think something like that. Then she said something that made me see her completely differently: I don't have to prove anything. Be grateful I even dated you. That sentence hung in the air like a slap, and something inside me just clicked off. I told her, as calm as I could manage, that without a test, there'd be no wedding. She ran into the bedroom, crying, and immediately called my mother. Diane called me an hour later, comparing me to my father, saying I was looking for an excuse to run away from my responsibilities, just like he did. My brother, Kevin, sent me a string of texts basically celebrating the fact that the golden child had finally screwed up, too. Sarah had gotten to them first, told them her version where I was the paranoid, jealous boyfriend trying to dodge being a father. They believed her without even asking for my side. I sat there that night, surrounded by people who were supposed to love me, all of them convinced I was the villain. And I realized nobody cared about the truth, they just cared about the version that fit their narrative. So I went online. I ordered the test and I made myself a promise: no matter how much it hurt, no matter what I found out, I needed to know the truth. Because living in that fog of maybe was worse than any answer I could get. The test kit arrived in a plain brown box 3 days later: sterile swabs, instruction sheets, and a prepaid envelope that felt heavier than it should. I waited until Sarah was at work and turned the whole thing into a game for Leo. Told him we were doing a science experiment and let him think the cotton swab was a toy. He laughed and yelled, my turn, when I swabbed his cheek, totally clueless about what was actually happening. And that's what broke me. The fact that he was so happy and trusting while I was destroying everything we had. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching the whole thing. Didn't say a word, just had this look on her face, like she was watching her own funeral. She'd agreed to the test after I made it clear the wedding was off without it. But you could see in her eyes that she already knew something was wrong, that this wasn't going to go the way she wanted. I sent the samples in that afternoon and spent the next 5 days living on autopilot, going to work, coming home, taking care of Leo, barely sleeping. When the email came through, I was sitting in my truck in a parking lot after finishing a job. I opened it on my phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The screen loaded slowly, and then I saw it: probability of paternity 0%. Not 5%, not unlikely, just 0. A flat rejection of everything I'd believed for 2.5 years. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but my head felt completely empty, like my brain had just shut off to protect itself. I drove home in a daze, finished up my day like a robot. And the whole time, I kept thinking the same thing, over and over: I'd been a father for 2.5 years. I'd changed diapers, stayed up through fevers, taught him to say truck and dog. And now a piece of paper was telling me I was nobody. When I got home, I walked straight up to Sarah and showed her my phone, with the results pulled up. Didn't say anything. Just let her read it. She went white instantly. And here's the thing that confirmed everything: she didn't act surprised. Didn't say, that can't be right, or let's get another test. She just looked at me like she'd been caught. I asked her when she and David actually broke up, and the whole story came spilling out. They hadn't split 8 months before we met, like she'd always said. It was 6 weeks, maybe less. There had been one last time with him right before she met me at that barbecue. When she found out she was pregnant a month later, she knew there was a chance the baby wasn't mine. But she convinced herself it had to be, because the alternative was too messy. She looked at me, at my stable job, my house, my desperation to be a good father, and she saw someone who'd stick around, someone who'd take care of her and the baby no matter what. David was unreliable, broke half the time, full of big dreams but no follow-through. So, she made a choice, picked the better option, and just decided not to think about the possibility that she was wrong. She didn't give me the truth, didn't give me a choice. She just turned me into a resource and let me believe I was building a family. I felt something crack inside me when I realized what she'd done. Not just the cheating or the lying, but the fact that she'd stolen my right to choose whether I wanted to stay or go, knowing the full picture. I told her to pack her stuff and get out. She started crying, begging, throwing out every argument she could think of. She said, "Leo needs you, and we're a family," and tried to make it about him instead of what she'd done to me. I kept my voice steady and told her, "You took away my choice. Now I'm making mine." And she finally left, drove back to her parents' place with half her things still in boxes, like she thought she'd be coming back. The house felt wrong after she was gone. Not because it was quiet, but because it was missing the sound of Leo's voice, the little footsteps running through the living room, the toys scattered everywhere. I'd planned to cut everything off, move to a different place, start over completely, and just forget this chapter of my life ever happened. But everywhere I looked, there were reminders, drawings on the fridge, a stuffed dinosaur on the couch, a tiny jacket hanging by the door. My mom still thought I was the bad guy, still compared me to my father, and refused to hear my side. Kevin was spreading stories behind my back about how I'd abandoned my kid the second things got hard. I hadn't shown anyone the test results yet because I was too broken to fight, too exhausted to defend myself. So, I just let them think whatever they wanted. Then, Sarah told David, and he got involved. He did his own paternity test and found out Leo was biologically his. At first, he was all in, talking about custody and his rights as a father, how he was going to step up and be there for his son. He made all these promises about being present, about building a relationship, about finally being the dad Leo deserved. I moved out of the house into a smaller apartment closer to work. I couldn't stand being surrounded by memories of a family that turned out to be built on lies, and I told Sarah she could stay there temporarily until we sorted out the legal mess and figured out who was keeping what. The apartment was one bedroom, with blank walls and no memories, just empty space where I could try to rebuild myself from scratch. But at night, sitting in that empty apartment, surrounded by moving boxes, I'd remember things I didn't want to remember: Leo's first smile, the way he'd run to me when I picked him up from daycare, how he'd fall asleep on my chest during movie nights. The DNA test said he wasn't mine. The paper said I was nobody to him. But Leo didn't know how to read test results. And in his world, I was still dad. That thought kept me awake more than anything else. The idea that somewhere across town, there was a little kid who didn't understand why I disappeared, who still thought of me as his father, even though science said otherwise. I'd spent my whole life trying not to be like the man who abandoned me. And now I was doing exactly what I swore I'd never do, walking away from a child who loved me. I kept a little wooden truck I'd built in my new apartment's closet, something I'd made for Leo back when I still thought he was mine. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away or even give it to him, because I didn't know if I had the right to anymore. The custody arrangement between Sarah and David started falling apart almost immediately. David learned real fast that being a biological father and being an actual dad are two completely different things. He showed up for the first few visits, then started canceling, blamed work or traffic or whatever excuse sounded good that week. Within 2 months, he was basically a ghost. Sarah was stuck living with her parents, working a retail job with awful hours just to keep up with bills, exhausted and stressed, and dealing with a toddler who kept asking where I was. David eventually moved to a different city for work, paid the bare minimum child support the court made him pay, and acted like Leo didn't exist outside of a monthly bank transfer. Meanwhile, I was in my apartment, trying to convince myself I'd made the right choice by walking away. But every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was a message about Leo. Every time I drove past a park or a toy store, I thought about him. The truth was settling in slowly, painfully. I could walk away from Sarah. I could cut her out completely and never look back. But walking away from that little boy felt like ripping out a part of myself. And no DNA test in the world could change that. I didn't go to the gym to forget. Didn't do the whole cliché workout montage thing because that's not who I am, and it wouldn't have helped anyway. Instead, I turned the small garage space at my apartment into a workshop. I started taking on side projects, restoring old trucks and motorcycles, building custom wooden furniture like shelves and benches and coffee tables, just to keep my hands busy. There's something about working with your hands, seeing a broken thing become whole again, that makes more sense than anything a therapist could tell me. I needed that kind of tangible progress when everything else in my life felt destroyed. One weekend, I built this little wooden toy truck, painted it red and blue. I kept it in a box in my closet because I didn't know if I had the right to give it to Leo anymore, but I also couldn't throw it away. The fact that I was even making something for him months after the DNA results told me everything I needed to know about how I really felt, even if I wasn't ready to admit it yet. David lasted about 4 months as a father before reality hit him hard. And reality looked like sleepless nights when Leo got sick, constant bills, fights with Sarah about schedules and money, and the realization that kids aren't a weekend hobby you can just drop when it gets inconvenient. He started showing up late to pickups, then canceling altogether. Eventually, he took a job in another city and basically vanished, except for the minimum child support payments the court forced him to make. Sarah was drowning, working long retail shifts with terrible hours, living with her parents who helped but also judged every choice she made, and dealing with a toddler who kept asking where I was. She started texting me, first about practical things, then about how Leo missed me, how he cried at night asking for Daddy, and how his birthday was coming up and could I maybe just stop by for an hour. I stared at those messages for days before I answered. Part of me wanted to stay away and protect myself from more pain. But the bigger part of me couldn't stand the idea of that little boy thinking I'd abandon him the way my father abandoned me. So I showed up to his 3rd birthday party at Sarah's parents' house. I walked in feeling like an intruder at my own kid's celebration. And the second Leo saw me, he dropped his toy and ran across the room screaming, "Daddy," with his arms wide open. That moment destroyed every wall I tried to build. Because DNA doesn't mean anything to a 3-year-old. Biology doesn't matter when you're the one who taught him to tie his shoes, and read him bedtime stories, and made him feel safe. The paper said I was nobody. The test said he wasn't mine. But when he crashed into my legs and hugged me like I'd been gone for years, I realized he'd already chosen who his father was. And no lab result could change that. I sat down with Sarah after the party and laid out my terms. I told her I'd be in Leo's life, but there was no us, no second chances, no getting back together. Everything we did had to be about him and nothing else. She agreed immediately, too desperate and exhausted to argue. We set up a schedule where I'd take him a few days a week, help with daycare costs, show up for school events and doctor appointments. She tried a few times over the following months to hint at us trying again, said things like, "We could be a family again for Leo's sake," or "You were always better than David." But I shut it down every single time. I kept my responses cold and clear. I told her, "I'm here for Leo. That's it." I refused to engage whenever she tried to make it about our relationship, because I'd learned the hard way that she'd already made her choices, and I wasn't going to be her backup plan twice. My mother kept calling me irresponsible, kept saying I was just like my father for walking away. Kevin was telling people at family gatherings that I'd abandoned my kid the second things got complicated. So, finally, I'd had enough of being the villain in everyone else's story. I gathered all my evidence, screenshots of Sarah's messages where she'd admitted the timeline, copies of the paternity test results, bank statements showing I'd been supporting Leo even after moving out, everything I needed to prove I wasn't the monster they'd made me out to be. I sent Diane an email with all of it attached. I wrote out a full explanation of what actually happened, with dates and facts, and ended it with something like, "You compared me to Dad when I was just trying to find the truth. You chose to believe her lies over asking me for my side. Here's the reality you refuse to hear. I sent something similar to Kevin, called him out for celebrating my pain instead of supporting me, and told him if he wanted any relationship with me going forward, he needed to publicly admit he was wrong in the same family group chat where he'd trashed me. It took 3 days of silence that felt like forever, and I honestly thought they might just double down and cut me off completely. But then Diane finally sent a long message to our family group chat. You could tell she'd been crying when she wrote it because there were typos everywhere and sentences that didn't quite make sense. But she admitted she'd been wrong about everything, explained that Sarah had lied about the paternity and the timeline, apologized for comparing me to my father when I was actually trying to be responsible, and asked if I could forgive her for not listening. Kevin's apology came a few hours later, and it was shorter, more forced, clearly written because Mom had probably called him crying and demanded he make it right. But it was public, and that's what mattered to me. I wasn't trying to humiliate them. I just needed them to stop treating me like I was the villain when I was the one who'd been lied to and manipulated for years. A year and a half later, my life looks completely different from what I'd planned, but better than I expected in a lot of ways. I've got a solid routine with work. My side projects in the workshop bring in extra money and keep me sane. I've been slowly fixing up the house and might sell it or rent it out permanently. I've even started seeing someone new. Nothing serious yet, but it's nice to know I can trust again eventually. Leo spends 3 nights a week with me. We've got our own traditions now, like building model cars together on Saturday mornings and hiking trails on Sundays when the weather's good. David barely exists in his life anymore, maybe a phone call every few months, if that. Sarah's situation hasn't improved much. She's still working hard but struggling. And I can see in her eyes every time we do a handoff that she knows she destroyed the best thing she had. Last month, Leo brought home a drawing from preschool. One of those my family assignments where kids draw stick figures. He'd drawn himself, me, and the dog I'd adopted a few months back. Sarah was off to the side, but David was nowhere on the page. He pointed at the picture of me and said, "I drew us, you and me. You're my dad." And I had to turn away for a second because it hit me harder than any DNA test ever could. I realized then that I hadn't won some legal battle or proven anything to anyone who mattered. I'd just done what my own father couldn't do. I stayed. Papers said Leo wasn't mine. Science said I was nobody to him. Biology tried to tell me I had no obligation to be there. But none of that mattered, because he'd made his choice, and his choice was me. When he runs to me with his arms open and yells, "Dad, I don't need any test to tell me who I am." Because he already knows, and that's the only proof I'll ever need. I didn't choose his DNA. I didn't choose the circumstances that brought him into my life. But he chose me as his father. And I choose every single day to be worthy of that. In the end, that's the only thing that matters. What would you have done in my situation?